the FBI at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. Prosecutors are now citing text messages that they found back then as evidence for many of the charges today. But this didn't go without a Chinese response. China demanded for Washington to immediately withdraw its request and is calling for Meng's immediate release, calling it an unreasonable crackdown.
China is strongly dissatisfied with and firmly opposed to the U.S. for insisting on submitting the extradition request to Canada, despite China's earnest complaints. We again urge the U.S. to immediately withdraw the arrest warrant on Ms. Meng Wanzhou and their extradition request. In the meantime, we urge Canada to take China's solemn position seriously and to immediately release Ms. Meng Wanzhou to protect her legitimate and legal rights, instead of placating the U.S.
Huawei released a statement denying that it committed any of the violations cited by the U.S. The company denies that it or its subsidiary or affiliate have committed any of the asserted violations of U.S. law set forth in each of the asserted violations. But it looks like the Huawei case is just an early indicator of the broader road ahead for U.S. national security policymakers. This more aggressive approach to China was apparent not just in these indictments, but in Washington, D.C. today. U.S. intelligence chiefs testified earlier before the Senate Intelligence Committee to provide lawmakers with an update on worldwide security threats. China was at the top of that list.
It was exposed yesterday in a significant way relative to telecommunications. We have alerted our allies. They are now second-guessing in questioning their initial responses to China. China's military capabilities and reach will continue to grow as it invests heavily in developing and fielding advanced weapons.
Coates went on to say both Russia and China pose the biggest threat in espionage and cyber attacks to the U.S. and are more aligned than they have been in decades. Scottie, it's no coincidence that the Huawei case and today's national security hearings are playing out just a day ahead of U.S.-Chinese trade talks that are resuming here in Washington tomorrow, especially since reports cite intellectual property theft and cyber issues as the largest remaining areas of disagreement between the two countries.
Well, Sarah, as we know, it is a small world. After all, it's not just a Disney song. In this case, what's going on presently with Venezuela, has China gotten involved yet and taken an official stance? Well,
China, once again today, backed more weight on the standing president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and are saying that these U.S. sanctions, the sanctions that they placed yesterday, are only going to worsen the lives of the Venezuelan people who are already hurting.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how tomorrow's talks go. Thanks for joining us, Sarah. For more, we turn to former official in the United States Trade Representative Office, Steve Gill. Thank you for joining us, Steve, from Nashville.
Thanks, Scottie.
Okay, we've been talking about this for a while now, but in this case, Huawei is accused of attempting to steal trade secrets from T-Mobile, a name people might not know Huawei, but they definitely know T-Mobile here in the United States. How big of an issue is IP theft from Chinese companies today?
I think it's a huge issue, and as we've talked here for the last couple of months as this trade war has escalated, it is the centerpiece of what the U.S. is trying to accomplish as this trade negotiation continues, and the Huawei case has just, moved it to the top of the list. This isn't the first time that the U.S. has been at odds with China over intellectual property protection, theft, but this case with this major company is just making it right at the time that these trade negotiations are coming to a sensitive point, the issue that will be on the table when they meet again soon.
Well, that's the question. Is there any concern that possibly this was an attempt by U.S. tech giants to hurt a competitor, even though most people here in the U.S. don't know about Huawei? Isn't this an easy thing to prove whether or not yes or no they copied each other?
Well, I think that's what's going to be interesting in this case. If you have wire transfers, if you have technology that they can show has been stolen, it's going to be easier to prove your case. But people need to remember that this is an indictment, this is a charge right now, and there's been no proof put forward. And I think that this is exacerbating the situation between the U.S. and China. I mean, picture for a moment if Jeff Bezos' daughter or wife went to China, was arrested, or if Bill Gates, if a major U.S. company had one of their sons or daughters arrested because Meng is the daughter of the top industrial specialist in China, it would cause a firestorm of controversy in the U.S., and we're seeing the same thing in a response in China as well. It looks to them like it's a negotiation ploy. On the U.S. side, they're trying to make it appear that this is just trying to protect intellectual property. It's just a normal criminal case.
Well, that's interesting because I don't think family members ever being involved in this should be necessarily a negotiation technique, but obviously it's being used as a pawn in this game. So a Chinese
Even the mafia leaves kids alone.
I mean, exactly. There are rules. The press might not leave kids of politicians alone, but at least the mafia does. So a Chinese delegation will be landing here in Washington on Wednesday to work on trade talks. Will these charges against Huawei make those negotiations even more difficult, or do you think they're just going to kind of not talk about the elephant in the room?
Oh, I think they'll talk about the elephant in the room. It is too big a deal, and it really, again, hits right at the point that the American side has been making about the theft of intellectual property, the government involvement in China that has dictates that companies have to provide information to the government. That has some on the U.S. side claiming that every company in China doing business in the U.S. is essentially a spy. That is not the case, but that's the kind of ratcheted up hostility that we're starting to see play out between these two countries as we get close to a deal, but may see it fall apart over these kinds of issues. Okay,
Steve, help me out here and consider this, because we know that Apple is an American company, but we've already shown time and time again in a lot of products like Apple, they might start in the U.S., but they go across seas into China, into Asia, and are built and then are shipped back over here. There's tariffs, there's all sorts of things involved. How can you prove that intellectual property is actually being stolen when it's being made on their territory mainly?
Well, part of the deal is that to do business in China, they have these forced partnerships that give the Chinese companies access to your patents, access to your intellectual property. And that's been one of the rubs with the United States, saying that forcing companies to disclose their information in order to get into the China market is a big part of the problem in terms of the trade balance between the two countries. Again, picture it that you've got 1.5 billion people in China. That's a pretty attractive market to all these other companies that are wanting to sell things into China. We have about 350 million people here. So the interest in selling to all those consumers is what drives U.S. companies to want to get there. But at the same time, if they're having to trade off everything they know and suddenly they find products made in China that don't have their name on them being sold in the United States or around the world, that's the problem that the U.S. is trying to address.
Okay, so at the end of this week, do you think we're going to be closer to a trade deal with China? And what role now is all of the commotion going on down south in Venezuela going to play in these talks?
I think the Venezuela talk is concerning because of the oil impact. I don't think the U.S., unlike your professor who was on earlier, is really desperate for Venezuelan oil. But I do think that other countries around the world are desperate for continued flow of oil, not just to run automobiles, but also for use in the manufacturing capacity. So I think, again, it's a global economy where when you squeeze a part of the balloon here, it does have a tendency to pop out somewhere else. Similar to what's happening, I think, with this criminal case, what it does is more than just what's going to happen in the criminal courts. It's going to have an impact on these trade negotiations. And right now, I'd have to say it's going to have a pretty negative impact.
Well, obviously, they're all going to kind of go like dominoes and fall into place. How optimistic are you in the talks tomorrow that we might actually go forward and not necessarily take 2 steps back as we've seen in the past?
I think we're likely to see 2 steps forward, but still 1 step back. So we're not really close to the finish line. We just make a small forward step towards, hopefully, a trade deal that will be able to ratchet down some of the animosity that's being built. Again, this Huawei case is putting fuel on the fire of an already difficult situation, and I'm not really sure what the exit strategy is for the U.S. federal enforcement to find a way out of it.
Well, unfortunately, drama never helps the situation. In this case, sometimes it seems like we're watching more of a reality show or the tabloids than necessarily what we're dealing with our national economy. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Thanks, Scottie.
Now to the arraignment of Roger Stone. The longtime advisor to President Trump left the district courthouse here in Washington, D.C., and once again gave the victory sign, just like Richard Nixon. Now, Stone pleaded not guilty on several charges connected to special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia probe investigation. RT correspondent Ashley Banks is outside the district courthouse with the latest. Thank you, Ashley.
I'm here at the U.S. District Court where Roger Stone, a close ally of U.S. President Donald Trump, made an appearance. Stone arrived here in the nation's capital just days after he was arrested by FBI at his South Florida home. Hours after his arrest, he posted bail. Now this morning, Stone faced a federal judge and answered not guilty to 7 charges.